The geology of northwestern Ontario defines the region as one of the most enticing and dramatic locations in North America. Situated on the shore of Lake Superior, a wide range of rock formations represent several important events of Earth history. My curiosity about the origins of this environment has been the impetus behind this documentary. To my great fortune, two friends and fellow residents of Silver Islet agreed to help tell the story of how this unique area developed. Scott Cheadle and his brother Burns both chose the study of geology as their life's work, and have been most gracious in offering their expertise in explaining the story and putting it in context of our planet's history.
Well, this is a great vantage point to see all the main elements of the geology that form the beautiful shoreline of Lake Superior here in the area of Silver Islet. During the course of our tour along the shoreline, we're going to see the effects of four principal geologic episodes. We're going to see the different rock types that make up those four episodes. So I'll just try to set the context in a very broad brush way, and then as we proceed with our tour, we will get into a little bit more detail of each type. The original geology of this area was Archean age rocks, some 2.5 billion years old. The geology we see here today was deposited on top of that Archean basement. The first type of rock we will look at is something called the Rove Formation. This is a shale or grey-wacky type rock that was deposited about 1,800 million years ago in a period known as the early Proterozoic. The second type of rock we'll see are the Sibley group sediments. They came along about 300 million years later and were deposited on top of the Rove Formation rocks. This represented a significant change of environment for what was going on at the time of the Rove to what was going on at the time of the Sibley, and we'll detail some of those the features of those environments. The third major geologic episode was perhaps the most dramatic in this area, and it involved an attempt on the part of the Earth to split the early North American continent into two pieces, something called the Mid-Continental rifting event. This was a period of time when magma was welling up from deep within the Earth and oozing out along a crack that was splitting what's now the Lake Superior Basin wide open. In the course of doing that, we had two types of igneous geology occurring. Intrusive type, where magma was oozing up through cracks in the existing geology, and extrusive type volcanism, where lava was actually making it out onto the surface and flowing. So we're going to see elements of these different periods of geological or rock deposition or injection as we move throughout the area. The final thing we will talk about is what made Lake Superior what it is today and what's left the shoreline looking like it is, and that is the most recent episode of glaciation. Now, some 2 million years ago, I should say, this whole area of North America was subject to periodic advances and retreatments of ice, thick sheets of ice that scoured the countryside, radically altering the surface of the Earth. The last period of glaciation in this area receded about 10,000 years ago, and the meltwater from that ice is the lake water in the Superior Basin today. And much of the shoreline is exposed. The erosion that occurred when that ice ground the rocks away leaves us with the things that we see today. Unfortunately for us, it's left it at a very nice level where we're going to be able to see some really interesting details. Each of these three periods of geology have left features that have been undisturbed since the time they were first deposited between 1.8 billion and 1.1 billion years ago. So let's go on a tour and see some of these details. Well, here we are at the site of the old historic Silver Islet mine, and I guess any geology cruise along this part of the beautiful north shore of Lake Superior should start here. And in a real sense, this is where the human history of Silver Islet began. But in a sense, this is where the geological story really comes to its conclusion. So over the course of our little tour along the shoreline here, we'll see various elements of the geology and the geological sequence of events. But it seems appropriate really to start here at the mine. This mine was originally discovered in the late 1860s by a mining company out of Montreal that owned some of the mining rights along the North Shore here. And silver had been found on the mainland in the Thunder Bay area, and in the course of their explorations, they wanted to check out some of their properties along the North Shore. And eventually they found themselves on a godforsaken little piece of rock that was about half the size of what you see behind you now, but exposed at the surface and partly under the water that covered part of this rock was a beautiful vein of very rich silver ore that was subsequently mined. The Montreal Mining Company began working the mine in the period of 1868, 1869, but they soon discovered that it was going to be a major operation to work a mine on such a small piece of rock in a deep, cold, and harsh lake like Lake Superior, and they sold it to a company in the States who subsequently came up and started the development of the mine. Now this mine is, as I say, a feature of the last big episode of geology that occurred here, but we can see some of the main elements that formed what became this ore deposit. This island sits on a long string of a kind of rock called diabase, and we'll see more of these diabase structures. And this one's called the dike, which is essentially a vertical wall of lava that oozed up in a crack. And the mine site itself is located at the intersection of a dike that trends off to the northeast, and you can see the string of islands extending out past Pyritic, that little island there, and a small rock shoal beyond it that form a long linear element of lava that was intersected by a fault that ran off towards the northwest in this direction. And where that fault intersected this dike, there was a very rich vein of material emplaced by circulating fluids, hot fluids related to the episode of volcanism that was emplacing this vertical wall of lava. And that ore was, for a time, the richest silver ore being mined in Canada. Now these miners started on a small piece of rock and have sank shafts down over 1,250 feet straight down into the lake. The mine shafts are exposed just beneath the waves around the corner of the island, and it's really something to look down those mine shafts and think of people being lowered down there on a steam-driven winch. And if this is a little piece of paradise up here, those were certainly the portals to hell, because it really must have taken men of some courage and perhaps questionable judgment to go down those holes and dig that ore out. But when they had good ore, it would bloom out into very nice pods of extremely rich ore. But as they dug down, the ore would thin out, and then they'd reach new pods and they would sink stopes out. But by the time they got down to about 1,200 feet and beyond, it was leaned out to the point where it was getting difficult to sustain the operation of the mine. But this is really the tail end of our geological story. What was going on here was preceded by much larger events, and I think if we work our way along the shoreline, we'll be able to explore those elements in chronologic sequence.
Now, before we talk about the rocks themselves, I think it's important to try to give you some idea of the setting at the time that the rocks started to get deposited in this area. Some 2 billion years ago, the North American continent didn't exist in its current form. This area is underlain by an ancient Archean terrain known as the Superior Craton. Continents grow by accretion. Older pieces of rock come together by the forces of plate tectonics. And those forces were starting to build up what became the North American continent at about that time. Far to the north and the west, there was a large mountain range that was being formed as older Archean terrain from the northwest was colliding on the north side of the Superior Craton, compressing rocks that had formed in oceans and sea basins between those old terrains. Likewise, to the south of us, down in the area of what is now northern Wisconsin, there was a mountain range forming there, and essentially an island arc offshore. And as that moved into the southern margin of the Superior Craton to accrete, there was a basin in between there. So sediment was being eroded from those mountains to the south. Sediment was being eroded from mountains to the north and the west. And that sediment was falling into a basin of water that covered this area some 1900 to 1800 million years ago. The Rove Formation is fairly thick. It's about 500 meters of sediment deposited over a period of approximately 50 million years. What we see here in the Silver Islet area is just the upper portion of that. The deeper portion of the Rove, which we don't see here, was mostly formed from sediment that was being deposited, shed off those mountains to the south of us at a very slow rate. It took some 10 million years just to form 100 meters of that sediment. And to tell you a little bit more about the sedimentation and some of the features we see in these rocks, I'll turn it over to Burns.
What we're standing on here in the Rove Formation is purely a submarine deposit. They don't really tell us anything particularly about the climate of these times, but the overlying Sibley group rocks that we look at later are actually deposited at the surface or very close to the surface, and they tell us an awful lot about that climate. But that doesn't mean that these rocks don't have anything to tell us. In fact, as these sediments were being shed off this mountain range that was now impinging on the North American Craton from the north, they were shedding sediment down into this basin, and it's preserved as these layers of rock we have behind us. The distinction that we find between the lower Rove Formation and the upper Rove is the lower Rove is mainly mud. It's very flat lying, thinly bedded. These beds, however, are quite different. There's a lot more sand here. That means two things. One, we're probably a little closer to the source of that sediment, and we're probably in shallower water. But we can read the story of these sands very nicely in cliffs just like these ones behind us, because they're preserved in beds. A bed is a depositional unit. It tells us about an event in time. And each bed is separated from the subsequent bed by a surface that can represent an extraordinarily long gap in the record. But we won't focus so much on that. What's of interest, at least to me as a sedimentologist, is seeing what's happening in these beds, because they have very distinctive structures. They have structures that show the impact of wave on the sediment surface, and that means they had to be deposited in relatively shallow water. Now, relatively shallow water is still enough water to drown in, but in terms of the kinds of ocean basins we have today, these rocks would be deposited in areas like continental shelves or a shallow basin like the Adriatic Sea. We have preserved sedimentary structures right along this face, here and here. And these structures are very nicely preserved examples of what are known as wave ripples. So in this case, these structures are formed probably when you have very large storms on the surface of this seaway that deposited the Rove Formation. And as the storm waves are rolling around the surface, they're moving the water around and shifting the sediment on the sea floor, forming these distinctive structures. So although these rocks don't tell us necessarily much about the climate at the time of the Rove Formation, they do tell us what's happening on the sea floor. They're telling us that this is a time when sand is being actively moved around by large storm waves on the surface. And these structures are a testament to that particular activity. One of the great things about sedimentary rocks is that you can read the record quite directly and interpret them in terms of a sequence of events. And this outcrop of the upper Rove Formation behind me right now is a great example of how you can do that. You know, we often have a sense that rocks are deposited over very long periods of geological time, but here we have something else that's quite different. On the lower part of this outcrop, you see very thinly bedded shale. This is dominantly mudstone. There is one thicker blocky bed that represents a sandstone, but for the most part, it's very flat-lying, not particularly interesting rock, probably deposited over a relatively long period of time. But look what happens immediately above it. The color changes to a lighter greenish gray color, and if you look at that rock very carefully, you'll see it's full of sand grains and silt grains. But the most important aspect of it is, if you look along the bottom of this bed, the bedding underneath provides a reference frame, and you can see that this overlying bed has cut down through several of those units, probably representing tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of years of deposition. And the base of that bed has scoured out a lot of that material, and in fact forms a bulbous bottom layer that represents the load of weight of that sand on the underlying shale. And it would have been essentially rock at the time this thing happened. But the really interesting thing is this kind of unit is very similar to what in modern sedimentology we would refer to as a turbidite deposit. It's a mass flow that happens effectively instantaneously. These types of sandstones come ripping out of submarine canyons and go screaming across the seafloor, carving up everything in their wake. And we know this from modern records. We know this happens not quickly in geological time, but quickly in human time.
Well, this exposure here is a great place to explain the next turn in our story. This outcrop here represents a contact, and it's a very significant contact for the geology of the Silver Islet area. Below me, I'm standing on the Rove Shale rocks, the oldest rocks in this particular location. And at this level here, there's a gap of some 300 million years, and overlying the Rove at this spot here is the next group of rocks we'll talk about, the Sibley Sediments. Now, apart from a very large gap in time, this represents a very significant change in geologic environment. If you recall, the Rove Shale, very distal sediments, fine-grained silts and sand, clay, transported long distances from their source, mechanically sorted into a very homogeneous gray rock, deposited first on the shelf and then down into a deep sea basin where 500 meters of material collected in this basin over a period of about 50 or 60 million years. At this level in our geologic sequence, we have a 300 million year gap, and that's a period of time 5 to 6 times as long as it took for the Rove Formation to be deposited. Lying above this contact, we have a whole different kind of rock altogether. Also sediments, but very different kind of sediments because they formed in a completely different situation. Now, when we look at these rocks in close-up, they'll give us some clues as to where the source rocks were that formed these. And we can see clasts in these rocks. In this case, they're kind of a lightish gray clast, somewhat rounded, some elongated, some a little more angular. But in this particular rock, these clasts are bound together in a cement of finer grained sands and mud. Now, these are a little bit unusual in that these particular clasts are this lighter color, more typical of the conglomerate rocks, as we see them all around the edge of Surprise Lake, and we can see nice outcrops as far up as Pass Lake. More typical, we see these dark, reddy brown clasts, also somewhat rounded. That would indicate they have been transported some distance. Some mechanical working has worn them down a little bit, but again, these clasts are now embedded in this grayish mud. And the one thing that you don't see a lot of in either of these two examples of the conglomerate is very much evidence of the Rove Shale. So these clasts are formed from rocks that must have formed or been exposed sometime in that missing 300 million year interval. Now, as we go further up the sequence from the basal conglomerate, we're going to see much more variety of sediment than we ever saw in the Rove Shale. The conglomerate will then be followed by sandy units, and we will see examples of sandstones with perfectly preserved beach ripples, indicating that that sand was forming very much along a lake shore, very similar to the lake shores that we see today. Other sediments we will encounter in the Sibley group include chemical sediments. So unlike these clastic or detrital type sediments where we're looking at grains that were eroded from pre-existing rock, we will also see a class of sediments known as chemical sediments where the rock forming minerals actually precipitate out of water as that water is evaporating. We will see a mixture of sands, mudstones. We will even see some very exotic formations known as dewatering structures. And we will see mass debris flows that must have occurred in a very high energy environment as this basin was forming and water was shedding that material down. So to tell us a little bit more about the Sibley rocks, let's see what my brother Burns has to say.
The rocks of this area are remarkably well preserved and faithfully replicate frozen moments in time, preserving in very exquisite detail traces of their origin. And they tell a very interesting story. You know, one of the fascinating coincidences of this particular area is that standing in this very spot, at various times in geological history, you would have been looking at a body of water out here. If we go on a little mental time travel trip back about halfway to the beginning of the planet, we would have been standing on the edge of a large ocean, and the continent of North America was much smaller than it is today. It would have consisted of rounded hills of granite and green schist to the north of our location. About 1.8 billion years ago, the continent suddenly grew by accreting terrains to the south, and this became a large inland sea that filled with shale. There was a pause in our geological record and for about 350 million years, which is a significant period of time. In that intervening time, this area stabilized and sagged down, and this became a great salt basin, a lake not unlike Great Salt Lake or Lake Eyre in South Australia. That lake eventually filled up with a great sand sea like the Sahara, and then we get another break in the record. And about another 350 million years later, the continent attempted to rip itself apart, and in doing so, expelled huge volumes of lava over the surface. And we still would have seen lakes out here, lakes like the Rift Lakes of East Africa. The final stage in this story is a glaciation that took place very recently, carved away much of the cover material, but the diabasin lavas that formed during that final stage have preserved these outcrops that we see today. Where we are right now is standing on the Rossport Formation of the Sibley Group. This is a formation that represents a period of a large lake system in this area about 1.5 to 1.4 billion years ago. Now, the interesting thing about the geology of these rocks is that in many instances, very thin intervals represent long spans of time, and sometimes very thick intervals represent extremely short periods of time. The outcrop we're standing on right now is a very good example of that. The white rocks all around me here are sandstones, and these were probably deposited very rapidly. They are surrounded by red rocks, which are dominantly mud-rich rocks. What's interesting in this particular outcrop is that the trained eye can see evidence that this sand was deposited very quickly and it was water saturated. As soon as that sand was deposited, that water wanted to expel itself out of these rocks. And we see features all through the outcrop behind me and certainly on this outcrop to my right. Features that we call dewatering structures. These would have been pipes of water that were spewing out from the outcrop as it settled and began to compress and start its long journey to becoming a rock. The feature here on my right is a particularly striking one, and at first it doesn't look particularly auspicious, but it's a round structure, a circular outcrop of sandstone. And if you look carefully at this one, you'll notice that internally it has concentric ring structures. But more importantly, a careful observation will show that it's actually cutting through the underlying red mudstone. And in fact, my interpretation of this particular outcrop is that it is the neck of a sandstone volcano, an injection of sand that popped right through the underlying strata and spewed out across the surface. It may, in fact, be the source of this overlying sandstone bed. The sandstone bed itself has a lot of small-scale versions of exactly the same thing, pipe-like structures that are testaments to the rapid deposition and extreme energy of this particular environment. This flat outcrop in front of us is a good example of many different geological features. When it was deposited as a sediment, it was deposited very rapidly and it was water saturated. And we see a number of circular ring structures all through this sandstone that are indicative of rapid dewatering of the sediment. And that was the first stage on its journey to becoming a fully consolidated rock. And what we see is a regularly spaced and regularly oriented system of joints that have chopped this outcrop into what for all the world look like paving stones. So this is a common feature throughout the area. A number of the diabase dikes and sills in the area have taken advantage of these fracture patterns, and they tend to be the dominant factor in the orientation of shorelines and cliff faces in the area. Here we have a fine example of the somewhat explosive nature of sedimentation in this basin. What we're looking at this particular outcrop is a layer of sandstone that's on top of a layer of this red Sibley mudstone. And what makes this outcrop particularly unique is we look at the surface, we see a number of what appear, for all the world, to be little craters. And if we look at these things in cross-section, what you realize is that's almost exactly what they are, but rather than having something fall down from above to make a crater, these are craters that have been formed by the explosive extrusion, probably of water in these cases. And some of the cross sections are very diagnostic of this style of sedimentation. So here's a great example of one of these injection features right in front of me, and you're looking at this in cross section. So this would have been the surface of the deposit, and this is looking at that same sandstone unit in cross section. And what we see along here is an upturned edge to this feature. Originally, part of it's broken off now, but originally it would have been roughly circular. And what's curious here is you see part of this central shaft to the feature. So this would have been the focus of the water being expelled, probably out of the underlying red mudstone, which would have been relatively water rich. And very likely this was a situation where you had a soft layer of relatively wet mud that was suddenly covered by this heavy layer of sandstone, which was in itself water saturated. And rocks don't like retaining water that way, so they'll get rid of it either slowly or quickly. In this case, they did so quickly when the water was expelled out to the surface. So we see the upturned edges of this feature. You can see that preserved in the rock layers. And here to my right is another example, a very nice little round feature with, looks for all the world like a little crater with the sides sloping away from the central shaft. So this would be a little geyser of water that would have spurted out and probably brought some sand with it, but what it's left is a hole now, and that hole miraculously has been preserved for about 1.5 billion years for us to marvel in today. Okay, we're now standing on an outcrop of the Pass Lake Formation, which is the lowest formation in the Sibley group. It's composed primarily of sandstone, and this is an exceptionally interesting outcrop. Behind me, what we're seeing is a cross-section. This is typically what you see in the Pass Lake Formation, a lot of apparently flat layered sands. And what's so beautiful about this outcrop is it tells you what you're not seeing in cross-section, because in fact, each one of these layers contains something very interesting, and that's what's lying right in front of me. Once we're able to look at a bedding plane surface of this rock, in other words, a surface as it was laid down at the time of deposition, all is revealed. Because what we can clearly see on this outcrop are these straight structures, these straight parallel ridges. And what these are, which is very apparent to anyone who's been to a beach, are wave ripples. Sand moves around only a few different ways. It can either be driven in one direction by a current, it can wash back and forth by wave action, and it can roll around in the air. This is the middle example where we've had wave action rolling the sand back and forth on a beach of a lake or a large body of water that existed about 1.5 billion years ago. So we're standing right on the shoreline, and the beautiful thing about an outcrop like this is that by looking at the orientation of these structures, we could tell where the shoreline was and what its orientation was. Because just as you can go to a modern beach and see that those ripples run parallel to shore, they certainly did the same thing in ancient times. Now, when you look at the outcrop in this sense, we're able to get away from that nondescript vertical section where you just see wrinkly, more or less horizontal banding, and we're now able to see what's happening on the surface of each one of those sand layers. And here, once again, we're looking at these oscillation ripples, and you can see the very clear traces of these ripples. And what we would normally do with an outcrop like this is measure these orientations, but in different beds. So not only do you get a sense of the orientation at one slice in time, but by looking at different layers, you can get a sense of the changing orientation of that shoreline over time. So for example, on this particular bedding plane, the orientation would have been parallel to these wave ripples. In this underlying bed, we see that that orientation has rotated somewhat. So over time, with a lot of measurements and a lot of mapping work, we're able to build up a picture not only of what the lake looked at one instant in time, but how it evolved over time. And that evolution continues to this day, because here's the really fascinating part. You don't have to go too far in either direction from where I'm standing, and current Lake Superior is eroding this sand and the sandstone, liberating those sand grains and reworking it into wave ripples that look exactly like this that you can see on beaches forming contemporaneously. One of the fascinating things about the geology of this area is that we see themes that are repeated time and time again over long periods of geological history. And we're looking at one of those examples in front of us right now. The green algae that is growing along the shoreline of Lake Superior is a very distant relative of some of the earliest forms of life on this planet. And in fact, within the Sibley group, there is a particular unit that carries a fossil record that we've interpreted as sediments that were deposited by the early ancestor of this very algae. And what we're looking at here is just a terrific contrast in styles of sedimentation. These gray rocks that I'm sitting on are called Krypt algal laminated Chert carbonates. The fine lamination that we see in these rocks has been postulated to be the result of the growth of algae at a time about 1.5 billion years before today. The rocks themselves are purely chemical sediments. There was no sand, no mud input into this basin. They're rocks that are precipitating out of the water, and some of that precipitation may have been aided by the algae that was growing in this environment. Immediately overlying this unit, across a very sharp contrast, we have a complete change in style of sedimentation. And what we have here is a debris flow. There are angular blocks, a jumbled mess of various types of mudstone and sandstone floating in a matrix of red mud. And this kind of deposit would have been a catastrophic mud flow deposit, a tumble of mud and rocks and boulders that came roaring over this surface, depositing up 5 to 10 meters of this catastrophic type of deposit. So it's a clear example of what we often see in geology is a sudden shift in environment from something that's very quiet to something that's extremely noisy.
Well, here we are at another interesting outcrop that tells a little story of a moment in geologic history that is beautifully preserved and exposed on this flat shelf of rock. Here we have some of this calcareous mudstone that's deposited horizontally. And when rocks are deposited in this way and get buried, they're laminated in a way that gives them strength in the vertical direction, but they're weak in the horizontal direction along the bedding planes. It's very characteristic of virtually all sediments. And that's why a lot of these outcrops that we're standing on tend to be large, flat sheets. They weather very easily across those surfaces. We also know that during the tectonic events that followed several 100 million years after these rocks were deposited, there was a lot of stresses. Lake Superior Basin was trying to crack open during this Mid-Continental rifting event. So these rocks were starting to move a little bit. And as we move from this part of the outcrop over towards that edge, we see a very interesting pattern develop. These broadly spaced cracks suddenly start to become closer and closer together. So we've gone from spacings of a few meters down to spacings of a few centimeters. And as we move right over towards the edge, we start to see that these fractures have become very close together. And that's had an interesting effect on the mechanical property of this rock. We're over on the main body of the outcrop. The rock was strong in the vertical direction and weak in the horizontal direction. This fracturing has chopped this rock up to where it has the same properties. You could think of it as like a deck of cards up on edge. So now this rock is chopped up in a way that allows it to slip along these fractures, and it can move either laterally or vertically, and there may have been some motion in both of those directions in this particular outcrop. I can't say, just standing here looking at it, what that direction of motion might have been. There are some indications here. We see a little kink in these fractures that indicates there was certainly some lateral slippage. The other thing we can't really say is, was this fracturing caused by the injection of that diabase magma, or did that diabase magma get injected into a plane of weakness caused by whatever fractured these rocks? Nevertheless, you can see a very clear association in the change of fracturing pattern in this rocks this zone of weakness that's developed here and this long linear feature that forms the boundary between this sediment and the diabase as it extends out behind me out into Middleburn Bay.
Well, here we're on the southeast side of the Shagwanaw Island, the Shags as they are known locally. And this is a beautiful example of a diabase dike. Many of the islands and a good part of the shoreline on the southern end of the Silver Islet area are formed by these diabase dikes. At the time of the Mid-Continental rifting event, there was a large plume of magma forming under what is now the Lake Superior Basin. And this magma it was intruded up along cracks in the host rock of older Anamiki age rocks. And these vertical cracks that formed under the stresses of this rising magma plume intruded these long, linear, and steep-sided walls of diabase lava. And diabase is a rock that's related to basalt, which was the main volcanic rock that was forming at the time. And off in the distance we see Isle Royal, which features layers of this kind of rock that were extruded onto the surface. Here we see along the flank of this diabase dike that it's almost vertical, but they generally have a very steep dip down towards the southeast, because the basin, as it was opening as part of this rifting event, was to the east of us. So we're on the western flank of the Lake Superior Basin as it was forming during this rifting event. But prior to the rifting, really getting going, the precursor to that was these plumes of diabase lava oozing up through cracks, in fact probably enhancing the original cracks. This is very hard rock, and it's well preserved today in this beautiful setting here on the backside of the Shags.
Well, here we are at the very beautiful Tea Harbor location. We're standing on the edge of a diabase dike that forms this long exposed shoreline. And the geology around this area is particularly appealing when it's exposed as it is here. In fact, Tea Harbor isn't just beautiful to look at and to be at, but it's very interesting geologically for a couple of reasons. This is one of the rare locations in this area where one of these vertical walls of magma that have oozed up through a crack in the host rock, these features we call dikes, actually transforms into a sill. In fact, it's likely that the magma oozing up to form the dike also spilled some of this magma laterally through or across the host shale formation to form this flat plateau of rock off to my left. So this is a very nice example of a dike and a sill together in one location. Now this is a nice location because this is one of those spots where the true story of what's going on here at Tea Harbor starts to reveal itself. This smooth, flat part of the rock I'm currently standing on is clearly diabase. As we look behind me on this side, right down at the waterline, we see clear evidence of the underlying Rove Shale. So this Rove Shale would have covered this whole area many hundreds of millions of years before any of this diabase magma started to become intruded. And here I think we're looking at the sill that has moved over top of the shale. So the dike would have intruded along the shoreline, and we can see the dike off in that far point that likely fed most of this magma. But here we can see that this diabase here is sitting on top of that underlying shale. Now we've moved across this little bay here from our previous location where we saw the Rove Shale underlying the diabase just down at the water line. So here we are now a few hundred meters away, and we're standing on this lovely outcrop of Rove Shale. And there's something very interesting going on in the rock here. You'll notice these fine subparallel cracks running through the shale, and these would be stress cracks. Something is really putting the heat and the pressure to these rocks. Now all rocks are made of a mixture of elements.
silicon, oxygen, iron, and all the other atoms that wind up making up rocks, and they form crystals. And these crystals would have 1, 2, or some number of different atoms in some fixed crystalline arrangement. But as you heat that rock up or introduce new chemistry, as might happen when you're injecting a magma of diabase composition, some of that fluid might start mixing into the host rock, changing the chemistry, and under tremendous temperature, those crystals are going to start to rearrange themselves. They'll start to undergo partial melting, and some of the atoms that are liberated when those crystals start to melt can mobilize through fissures in the rock or the porosity of the rock, and then reconfigure themselves into new crystal elements. And that's, I believe, what's going on in this particular location. We're just starting to see the first hints of the effects of that chemical infiltration and the heat affecting the original shale and partially changing it into a different kind of rock. Now, for all that interesting geologic detail, it is worth pointing out that sometimes rocks are just plain beautiful. And this is a lovely example of the texture of the rock, the weathering, these fine little lines. A human sculptor could only dream of creating something that looks like this particular outcrop. So this is a very complex little area here. There's a real mixture of rock types playing out here. That point of rock off in the distance, that little headland, represents the edge of the dike that extends all along the shoreline here to form the top bar of the T that is T Harbor. Well, here we have shale, relatively unaffected. We don't see much in the way of those stress cracks. So then moving from that shale over to here, this is pure diabase. And this transition is rather gradual and somewhat complicated. Now, we've talked about the diabase dikes as being these semi-vertical walls, and we've talked about the sills as being these long horizontal flat sheets of diabase, but nature never always sticks to such a simple plan. Really what we're seeing here is a complex mix of diabase and shale and a variety of arrangements. Here it looks like we've got basically a pod of this magma that's intruded in. It doesn't seem to be laterally continuous in any great sense. We see shale behind us there, shale right here, but clearly this shale has been heated up, diabase below it. We notice up on the cliff behind us too that these sills are not always of even thickness. We can almost see the contact between that diabase sill on top coming down and meeting the shale, which is identified by that thin horizontal stratification. And right up where this little birch tree is up behind us, we can see that diabase would be about 20 feet thick or so, but you can see the contact moving upslope. So over here behind me, that same sill is only a few feet thick. So we've got a very irregular arrangement between these shales and the diabase in this particular location. We really get all the different rock types mixed together and somewhat bent out of shape just due to the mechanics of this moving magma, which is very dense and hot rock, intruding into this friable and probably somewhat ductile shale under the influence of the magma. Now this is a nice example of one of the various forms of contact between this intruded diabase and the host rock. In this case, looking out to my right, this is a calcareous mudstone. Here's our diabase, and we can see down here a very sharp line. So mechanically, this rock intruded its way through this older sediment without mechanically disturbing this sediment to any great extent. But what we can see is an interesting gradation of color. So this is a very hot soup of magma injecting its way up through a calcareous mudstone. And what we're seeing in this color gradation is a zone of chemical alteration related to the injection of this chemistry in a very hot form into this chemistry, which is cold. And this is the zone in which the chemicals are mixing with heat and pressure
and causing this change in color and composition across this particular little interval. Well, no discussion of Rove Shale and the diabase dikes is complete, of course, without a visit to the world-famous sea lion. And this is a very nice example of erosion working on softer Rove Shale rocks and leaving the more resistant diabase rocks behind. Now, cliffs in the background, the top of the Sleeping Giant, the islands that we see out in the lake are all examples of hard diabase rock where all the shale that used to surround them has been scoured away. But the sea lion stands out, you could say, as a beautiful example of that thin walled diabase that was formed by this magma oozing up through a relatively thin crack in this case, still standing even though the shale cliffs have been beaten back by the waves now some 40 or 50 feet from the front of the sea lion. Well, there's a lot of reasons why people might be interested in geology and rocks. Of course, there's the obvious, the search for mineral wealth, whether it's gemstones and rubies and diamonds, whether it's energy in the form of oil and gas, or perhaps it's precious metals like platinum or gold or the silver ore that originally brought the miners here to Silver Islet. For some people, it's the study of fossils, the record of the evolution of life on Earth right from the earliest times when life forms were nothing more than single-cell bacteria. For me, the interesting thing about geology and rocks is that they inform us about processes that play out over a much longer time span than humans can generally comprehend. If we made a timeline of the history of the Earth that ran from the store at the far end of the avenue all the way up along the road to the beach end here, each meter of that trip would span 2.5 million years. The earliest periods of the Earth, the Hadean, when the Earth was being bombarded by meteorites in a semi-molten state, would cover the first few hundred meters of that journey. The long sweep of the Archean would take us up to about the halfway point. Our Rove rocks wouldn't appear till a little bit after the halfway point, would only span about 20 meters of that journey. Our Sibley Rocks would span about 40 meters, about 2/3 of the way along that journey. And all the volcanic rocks and the diabase dikes and sills would only occupy a few meters, about 3/4 of the way along that journey. And finally, bringing that trip all the way around to this point, the last meter, that last 2.5 million years, would be the entire history of hominids, and modern man would only occupy the last 8 or 10 centimeters of that journey. The history, as we call it, since the discovery of the mine, would be a sliver of time, too short to even measure. But for me, rocks really inform us of processes that go back even further than the origin of the Earth or the formation of our solar system. All the minerals that form the rocks that we can hold today came out of the heart of stars. Great balls of hydrogen and helium compressed by the forces of gravity, burned in their cores with the engine of nuclear fusion that slam those nuclei together and form heavier and heavier elements from hydrogen to helium up through carbon and nitrogen and oxygen, the important elements for life, on through silica and aluminum, calcium and magnesium, the important elements for rock forming. But that process can only take us as far as iron on the periodic table. It's a long way from iron up to uranium, and those elements can only be formed when those nuclear furnaces in the heart of stars lose the battle against gravity. And those stars collapse in the most titanic explosions in the cosmos, slamming nuclei and neutrons together to form all these elements. And it turns out silver in particular requires a very special kind of star, and it only forms under those peculiar conditions. When you hold a rock like this, it's a tangible reminder of where we fit into this great cosmic recycling scheme. And that's why not just a beautiful piece of silver ore, but really any rock is a miracle. Well, I hope you've enjoyed joining us for our little journey along the lake shore and learning a little bit about the rocks and their history that make up this beautiful area around Silver Islet. And I hope maybe it might stimulate a little interest on your part to learn a bit more about the rocks in your area and how that fits into the big history of the formation of the planet Earth.